All right, I think I'll jump in here. So again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Reese Gerholt. I'm the Communications Director for the Climate Program at World Resources Institute. And again, thank you very much for joining our webinar today entitled Net Zero Targets, Which Countries Have Them and How They Stack Up. Net zero targets have certainly grown in popularity in recent years, with thanks in no small part to the adoption of the Paris Agreement and research by the IPCC showing how costly and dangerous the climate impacts will be if we don't limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We have our experts here that will give an overview of what net zero really is, which countries have net zero targets, and what you should know about them. I think it'll be a really excellent primer for anyone trying to get their heads around what net zero targets are, and especially at the national level. We'll touch briefly on the corporate city side of things, but today we're really focusing in on those national net zero targets. So first, I'd like to introduce our speakers before we jump in today. Katie Ross will first answer the big questions about net zero, including why it's in the news, what it means, and what actions are necessary to get there. Johannes Friedrich will then present tools on our website, Climate Watch, and I encourage you to check out that website, climatewatchdata.org. These are things you can use to track national net zero targets, as well as showcase some other tools that will be helpful on that site as well. And then finally, Meng Pin will present net zero by the numbers, really digging into when countries set their targets and what those targets include. They're not all the same. That's important for you to understand those differences and the key attributes to setting a robust net zero target. We intend to leave plenty of time for your questions at the end of this session, and you can submit those questions at any time using the questions and answers feature on the Zoom webinar tool. And to answer the most common question we usually get, yes, we will be posting a recording of this webinar. It will be on the event page on WRI.org within 1 or 2 days. We'll try to get that up as soon as we can. So with that, I'd like to now turn the floor over to Katie Ross. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Reese, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And as Reese mentioned, net zero is really just getting this tremendous attention recently. These are just a selection of recent news clippings. It's topping the agenda in several leader-level discussions. It topped the agenda in the recent G7 Climate and Environment Ministers meeting a few weeks ago. And toward the end of last year, the UN Secretary General said that the top priority of the UN in 2021 is to build this global coalition for carbon neutrality. And several major emitters have announced commitments to reaching net zero GHG emissions. This includes China, the European Union, the UK, the United States, Japan, Canada, and Brazil. So really a tremendous momentum around this idea of going net zero. And then at the same time, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, there's been this increasing skepticism around net zero commitments. At the bottom of the screen, there are a few recent articles, one opinion piece, "Don't be fooled by net zero pledges." Another one, "Net zero emission targets are a hollow pledge." And "Forget about net zero, we need real zero." So I wanted to spend my time today just unpacking a little bit of this dynamic, what it actually means to set a net zero target, what it's going to take to reach global net zero emissions. Are we on track yet for reaching net zero emissions? And then come to this important question around greenwashing. So as Reese mentioned, we are kind of focusing today mainly at the national level, but did at the outset want to recognize the significant momentum underway for net zero commitments at the subnational level, including this important Race to Zero campaign, which is a coalition of cities, regions, business investors, all doing their part to contribute to limiting warming to 1.5 and setting their own commitments for net zero as well. So also just some context about going net zero, and this is not a tremendously new idea, and what I'm going to illustrate on the slide is certainly not exhaustive about everything that's come out on net zero in recent years, but The Paris Agreement actually does include language around going net zero. It's not said so explicitly, but the actual text is achieving a balance between human-caused emissions and removals by sinks. That's actually in the Paris Agreement, and that goal is to reach it globally in the second half of the century, and this is a commitment that all parties have agreed to. And then in 2018, the IPCC was commissioned to do this special report examining actually what it means to reach net zero in the context of limiting warming to either 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And I'll come into a little bit of those findings a bit later in my presentation. And then interestingly, as more and more parties submit their mid-century strategies to the UNFCCC, they're also increasingly exploring these more difficult questions around reaching net zero, and something also we'll pick up later today. So just the basics, I mean, what does it actually mean to reach global net zero emissions? And this is pretty nicely illustrated in this figure where you have the kind of gray wedge at the top, which illustrates the human-caused emissions. And first and foremost, these need to be reduced as much as possible. There is a little bit of residual emissions remaining still, and this is emissions that we just don't know how to avoid yet. This is such as emissions from agriculture, from aviation, from shipping, from heavy industry, where the technologies are just not yet developed enough to remove those emissions completely. And what needs to happen then is that the remaining emissions need to be balanced by an equal or more amount of what's known as carbon removals. And this is what's illustrated in the green shaded area below the line. And these removals can come from either natural sinks, so that's something like carbon dioxide absorption from trees and soils, or these more emerging technical solutions like direct air capture and storage. And then ultimately what you see here is a balance between emission sources and removals ultimately reaching net zero. So why does the world need to reach net zero emissions? Well, we're already experiencing tremendous impacts at the warming achieved to date, that we're at 1.1 degrees Celsius currently. So the IPCC looked at the scenarios for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And this is what their findings are, which is illustrated in this figure here. And what they show, in order to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, the carbon dioxide emissions need to reach zero between 2044 and 2052. And the remaining GHGs need to reach zero by 2063 and 2068. So it's a little complicated and there are ranges in there. And the reason that there are these differentiated gas approaches is because these are just scientific modeling studies which are optimized for least cost. And as I mentioned, some of these non-CO2 GHGs are really difficult to abate right now and sometimes very expensive. So that's just a little bit of context behind why there are these different milestones in the IPCC report for CO2 and for the remaining GHGs. And I mean, also kind of informing why there's this general clustering of net zero commitments around this mid-century timeframe. And I won't go into the details of the 2-degree scenario, but understandably, those have pathways of reaching net zero emissions a little bit later as well. So how is the world going to achieve net zero emissions? And the short answer is it's going to require fundamental and unprecedented transformations across all sectors of the economy. When we're looking toward reaching net zero emissions, there's not a sector or area of the economy that can hide from this. What these figures illustrate on this page are really not exhaustive of the kind of full transformations that need to take place, but they're just really illustrative. The IEA report that was released recently on reaching net zero emissions has some really significant milestones that need to be achieved in the energy sector. For example, 90% of electricity needs to be from renewables by 2050. It's got to be a complete phase out of internal combustion engines by 2035. Got to be phasing out coal by 2040. And then at the same time, there've also got to be significant changes on the land sector as well. There've got to be halting deforestation, focusing on reforestation, restoring degraded lands, and really improving the efficiency of food production as well. So that's just a flavor of the examples. I would really encourage you to read this recent IEA report, which goes into a lot more detail about the energy sector transformations that are required. Is the world on track yet for reaching net zero emissions by 2050? So despite the tremendous progress that's already been made at addressing climate change, we're currently not yet on a track for limiting warming to 1.5 and also reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. And my colleagues released this report last year called State of Climate Action, which illustrates the pace of change that needs to be happening across all sectors of the economy. And just a few examples here: renewables need to be ramped up at least 6 times faster. Tree cover needs to come back at least 5 times faster than current rates. So again, underscoring this message of significant and fundamental changes to all sectors of the economy. And I think importantly here, I mean, all scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 and reaching net zero emissions do require a significant amount of carbon removals. Again, that's both from natural sinks as well as technical solutions. So how many countries have committed to going net zero? Well, according to the Climate Watch count, which is illustrated in this map here, and my colleagues will go into this map a bit more detail later on in today's presentation. But the big picture count is that 59 countries representing 54% of global emissions have currently communicated a net zero target. So any country that you see shaded in this map has currently got a net zero pledge. The different colors just mean the ways in which the net zero target was communicated, whether it was in an NDC, long-term strategy, another policy document, in a political speech, or in law. And then by what year have countries committed to reaching net zero? So as I mentioned earlier, there is a general clustering around reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So that's that long list you see here of countries that have all committed to reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. A few countries have committed to reaching net zero emissions earlier. I mean, a notable announcement here was Germany, who recently moved its commitment from 2050 to 2045. And then there are some later announcements with China being quite notable, committing to carbon neutrality by 2060. Are net zero targets a form of greenwashing? So this is a question that comes up a lot. And the simple answer is no, but, and that is that valid concerns have been raised that really should be addressed in the context of this debate. The one is around the credibility of the target. So as I mentioned, reaching net zero emissions does require a lot of underdeveloped technologies that are not currently in place that will need to be scaled up. And it also requires a lot of balancing of carbon sinks, and there are really limits on those capacities. So there are some concerns around the credibility of the targets. And then the second and third points are quite related in that the target being so far away, are they seen as a distraction from the immediate and transformative change that's required right now? And also with politicians setting them right now, they will not be responsible for meeting them in 2050. So there is this dynamic about lack of political accountability. So to consider these questions about greenwashing, WRI produced a little animated video about what we can do to spot robust net zero targets, which I'm going to play now. The video is about 1 minute long. And just to underscore a few of the messages that were coming out in the video about how we actually go about spotting robust net zero targets, getting away from this idea that they're greenwash targets. The first important point to make is that these targets should cover all greenhouse gases and sectors. There are no sectors that can hide, so these targets do need to be pretty comprehensive. There should also be clarity on how much of the target is met through domestic emission reductions. This is really important, that domestic mitigation is the priority, with only a small amount of residual emissions ideally balanced by removals. There should be avoiding or limiting the use of international offsets. So international offsets, or ITMOs, is a really critical part of the climate puzzle and really going to be helpful for reducing emissions over the next few decades. But by mid-century, when all countries need to reach net zero emissions, there really will be limits into how many international offsets are available and can be traded. So there should be avoiding or limiting use of these types of mechanisms. The target should be communicated clearly, both on coverage and on timing. This has generally been done pretty well across the board. There is some difficult nomenclature around targets. Some countries commit to carbon neutrality, some commit to climate neutrality, some commit to going to net zero. It's not always clear what gases are covered unless they are explained elsewhere. And on timing also needs to be clear. So most countries are pretty specific with their target year for reaching net zero emissions, but some are a bit more vague, such as we plan to achieve net zero in the second half of the century, and that's a big range. And then where the rubber really hits the road is the importance of net zero targets informing near-term milestones, including in the NDCs. So a number of parties are increasingly referencing their net zero commitments or their long-term strategies in their updated NDCs, and this is a trend that we can expect to continue. And there should be a clear policy for working toward attaining that net zero target, and also transparent communication of the questions that still remain and need to be answered in terms of reaching those goals. Just in conclusion, if you are interested in learning more about net zero targets, my colleagues published a fabulous article a few weeks ago looking at some of the questions around net zero emissions, and we can certainly publish that in the chat afterward. And we also published a research paper last year that looks at designing and communicating robust net zero targets. So we'll drop that link in the chat as well. And with that, I will pass back to Reese.
Great, thank you very much. And now I'll just hand the floor right over to Johannes to take us to the next part of the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Reese, and thank you, Katie. So thanks everyone for joining. As many of you might be familiar with WRI's work, we'd like to provide you all of these interesting insights and summary numbers and information that you can get from our research, including in presentation, research papers, and so on. But an important thing that WRI also does is we know that not all of your questions can be immediately answered just by some summaries. So we want you to dive deep by yourselves into these questions. So this is why WRI has a lot of data platforms, and ClimateWatch is one of these platforms. So I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of what you can do yourself with ClimateWatch in the context of net zero, and also mention a couple of the other the other data platforms that WRI has, including Resource Watch, Global Forest Watch, around the energy sector with energy access, aqueduct and water risk. So definitely look at the broader range of what WRI offers. But I'm specifically in the context of net zero, I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick overview of how you can explore and find insights yourself on ClimateWatch. So what is ClimateWatch? As I said, it's a data tool, which basically means it's a website. You can visit it yourself. I'm going to open it up in a second. It has hundreds of data sets, hundreds of thousands of data points. It's all open, it's all for free. It's really just our mission to bring transparency around information, both, as Katie mentioned, around the more short-term nationally determined contributions, as well as the long-term strategies, and setting the context for the net zero targets and tracking those as well as understanding what this all means by country, with all of the greenhouse gas emissions that you have by sector, by gases. So this lets you really dive deep into all of the different aspects that are related both to short-term as well as long-term targets. To give you a little bit of an inspiration of how ClimateWatch is actually used and what the users are, so that you can actually understand that it's not just a website that sits there, but it's actually widely used. We are used by both a large research community, companies, but most importantly, a lot of governments. So if you work with governments yourself, definitely share this resource. Again, like, it's open, it's for free, everyone can access this, you can download all data. It's used widely in countries intended nationally determined contribution as well as the NDCs. So we are widely referenced, and we have several very good examples and quotes of different organizations uses it both for their planning processes, for their implementation processes. So this is again an inspiration for you. If you think some of your colleagues might be interested in using this type of tool, please share it. But with this, I actually want to give you a quick overview about what the key modules are of ClimateWatch, and then also how they relate particularly to the net zero work, and then hand over to Mang Pin, who gives you a couple of insights that you can actually learn directly from ClimateWatch, and then you can dive deeper into the data yourself. So with this is the ClimateWatch website, climatewatchdata.org. Some of you might have been on there. It gives you a quick overview about the latest updates, as well as different perspectives that you can dive into. You can look into different countries and do country deep dives. I'm not going to go too much into the details there. Sector deep dives, which we're going to expand over time. The commitments is exactly what Katie mentioned earlier, are the different perspectives around the Paris Agreement, both short-term as well as long-term targets that can quickly give you an explanation of how that all fits together. What are these commitments? What do the commitments mean? How many countries have ratified the Paris Agreement? How many countries have long-term strategies, as well as submitting new long-term strategies or submitting net zero targets? And then we actually have trackers for all of these different perspectives, both on the short-term targets, for example, the NDCs, to understand who has submitted them, and who are new countries, for example, that submit them, particular now that we are waiting for new submissions. Quickly see if I can switch to this. There you go. New submissions. And the similar thing with the long-term strategies. We have options to compare all targets. So if you're really interested in comparing these short-term and long-term targets and how they line up both on the near term and on the long term, you can see each of the countries, what they have submitted, as well as what are the specific targets, basically. It's just loading a little bit slow and I can't access the top part here. Other perspectives that are really important are, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, which gives you a perspective of what the actual tasks are around getting to net zeros. What are the trajectories of countries, as well as what are the trajectories of different sectors. So understanding what are the percentages of emission, how have they changed, either by share of emissions or even in total perspectives, to really fully understand what it means, that it connects to each part of the economy and what it means overall. Again, you can download all of these data sets directly here, as well as have some key visualizations that give you specific insights. Can download and share all of these pictures. A specific new offer that we have that might be really helpful for you is a resource bank PowerPoint presentation, which you will see a lot of these PowerPoint slides that we have in the current presentations are actually also available there. So you can download this, and if you just need a quick insight or a quick answer about a specific questions, both around net zero, around the short-term targets, the long-term targets, you can download these slides directly here and then put it into your own presentations. But with this, the key aspects that this is we're talking about today around the net zero targets, we have a specific tracker for you there. Again, might be able to answer a lot of questions, but if you want to come back and have a different questions, want to pull out different numbers, want to understand statistics around how many emissions are covered by a certain type of net zero targets, you can all explore this data directly here and on our net zero tracker. So Mangpin will provide you a little bit of insights of what you can actually learn from here, but just to show you a little bit, you can see all the indicators show either EU, because the EU is also a member of the UNFCCC, or single European countries. You can understand this by different type of indicators and different type of scopes that we will show some example of. And then most importantly, also see the data itself, seeing where were these commitments made. For example, there's often several commitments depending on countries. You can see what countries have actually said in which type of document, and then also understand, for example, what the years are that they have said, and all of the other information. And again, download and share it immediately. So this is just a very quick overview of Climate Watch. You can do a lot. Please sign up for updates if you're really interested. We have this notification bell now that gives you always, if you want to know if there's an update, but you can also sign up to the newsletter. If you have any feedback or anything that's missing there, we really built this tool for you. So if you have any suggestions or questions or ideas for how we can make it more useful or provide better insights for you, please also send us a message. We're happy to reply. But with this, I am gonna hand over to Mangpin, who will give a quick overview of what are the actual insights that you can learn if you actually look at all of this analysis that we have done with Climate Watch.
Trying to share screen here, and let me know when you can see my screen.
Yeah, looks great, Mangpin.
Okay, great, thank you. And now that we have heard from Katie about why the world needs to reach net zero emissions and what does it mean to reach net zero, and we have learned from Johannes about our powerful online data platform that we have. In this part of the webinar, we will look at the current pledges of net zero targets and what do we know about those targets, using a lot of the metrics, how to spot a robust net zero target that Katie has introduced. And you can find the data points we are talking about on Climate Watch. First of all, to recap, currently 59 countries represented by 48 parties have communicated a net zero target. And this is a screenshot of the Climate Watch net zero tracker that Johannes just demonstrated. The legend and colors of this map come from the indicator net zero target status of the net zero tracker. And this one represents where countries are setting their net zero targets. You might have noticed that I have been saying 59 countries have communicated a net zero target. And the reason we say communicated is because net zero targets can be formally adopted into a law or policy documents, and they can also be found in political pledges made by a country. And this is, for example, a speech or public announcement, but has not been formally adopted into a law or policy. So quickly look at the numbers here. A few countries, for example, Denmark, France, Germany, New Zealand, UK, have set their net zero targets in law, which is legislation that has been formally adopted by the national government. And next, we have 26 parties, including the European Union, that have set a net zero target in their policy documents. And this is, for example, NDCs and long-term strategies. And in addition, we also have 17 parties that have made a political pledge to achieve net zero. Together, those countries who have communicated a net zero target represent around 50% of global emissions, and 35% of global emissions are actually covered by pledges that are not yet formally adopted. And another trend we are seeing is that countries would commit to net zero target across law and policy documents. And this is beneficial in a very similar way, as Katie mentioned, that when we start to see NDC incorporating long-term strategy target that have been communicated, and the other way around as well. And this is that the target are more durable and binding in this way. And when net zero targets start to be incorporated into those documents, it helps aligning countries' near-term climate actions with longer-term targets. And this leads to our next slide, which looks at which year did countries set net zero targets. So we have looked at where countries are setting their net zero target, and this is when did countries set their net zero target. And this visual is a very nice way of seeing how the momentum for net zero target has quickly grown over the past year. Before 2020, we had fewer than 20 countries who had formally set a net zero target, either in their domestic laws or climate policies. Bhutan, for example, was the first country to set a net zero target in 2015, which is technically a commitment to stay net zero that it has been achieved by the country. Marshall Island commits to net zero in its long-term strategy document in 2018. And in 2019, 2020, we started to see more countries formally adopting net zero targets into their laws and policies. And many countries announced net zero targets in their political pledges, particularly over the Climate Ambition Summit end of 2020. And here we really expect to see more countries put forward net zero targets this year, and that countries who have made political pledges or have just, excuse me, stated aspirational visions to formally adopt net zero targets into legal commitments. Sorry. So another question that we might have when we are trying to understand a net zero target is, by when will a country achieve net zero or commits to achieve net zero emissions? And we know that to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, global CO2 emissions needs to reach net zero by 2044, and global greenhouse gas emissions need to reach net zero by 2066. And having those dates in mind when we look at countries' net zero targets, we can see that most net zero targets are set between 2030 and 2050, with a vast majority of countries commit to achieve net zero emissions simply by mid-century. A few countries who have only made political pledges, for example, China set targets for 2060 or 2070, and Singapore used more of a generic term of achieving net zero by second half of the century without specifying the target year. So Katie has explained this visual in her presentation as well, so I will not get into the details here, but I do want to mention that the information on this chart can also be found on Climate Watch Net Zero Tracker under the Net Zero Target Indicator. So the next two slides talk about the scope and coverage of net zero target. In earlier section, we have also learned from Katie on how to spot a robust net zero target. And just like what we would need to understand a normal greenhouse gas reduction target, a clearly defined target boundary is also important for describing a net zero target. And it is important as well, also because it could have significant impact of actual overall emissions in 2050 and the mitigation options that will be chosen and prioritized for achieving those targets. So looking at the legend here, most committed net zero targets actually cover all greenhouse gases, with only a few exceptions. And for example, New Zealand's net zero target exclude biogenetic methane, which is about half of the country's total greenhouse gas emissions, and net zero targets of Panama and Cape Verde are framed as carbon neutral targets. And as of countries that are not clear about their greenhouse gas coverage, one is that none of the political pledges provided information about gas coverage of their net zero targets. And countries, for example, South Korea and Spain, they also didn't specify the coverage in their long-term strategy documents where they committed to achieve net zero. And this one looks at the sector coverage of net zero target. And I have to start by saying that this particular indicator about sectoral coverage in a way actually reflects the research method that went into when we were compiling and maintaining this tracker of Climate Watch. So even though many countries might have set individual sectoral net zero targets for for certain sectors of their economies. Only the net zero targets that cover all sectors or economy-wide are currently included in the net zero tracker. And another important indicator that we have on Climate Watch, and it's not included here today as a slide deck, but it talks about the inclusion of international aviation and shipping that Katie had mentioned. And you might know that the common practice when compiling a national greenhouse gas inventory is that those emissions, we call those bunker fuels, they are not counted towards a country's total greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because those emissions happen outside of national boundaries. Those emissions can be estimated. And for example, on Climate Watch greenhouse gas emissions module, they are reported as a separate sector, but they are not included in any of the country level total greenhouse gas emissions. Those bunker fuel emissions, however, are included in the global total greenhouse gas emissions, and they're not insignificant. And so this is why countries should consider including emissions from international aviation and shipping, which might occur outside of their national boundaries in their targets. It's not on the slide here, but very, very few countries stated that they will include bunker fuel emissions when reaching net zero. And for most other targets, it's either unclear or undecided. So to summarize here on the scope and coverage, net zero targets should cover all the gases and sectors, including domestic sectors and international shipping and aviation. And among the existing net zero targets, almost all countries that have formally adopted net zero targets include all greenhouse gases and the domestic sectors in their targets. And in the meantime, political pledges usually lacks this type of details. And this is another reason that we hope that those targets could be formally adopted and articulated into legal documents with those details. So next slide. Just like countries' NDCs, and probably even more so for the net zero targets, it is quite important to understand whether the target will be achieved using international offsets. And this means whether the net zero target will be achieved from emissions and removals within a country, or emissions reductions or removals occurring outside of the country will be, for example, purchased or transferred and counted towards meeting the country's net zero target. And from the map and the donut chart, we can tell that very few countries specified whether they will or will not use international offsets, and that for half of global emissions that are covered by countries with a net zero target, it is unclear so far whether those targets will be met using international offsets. Of course, countries should prioritize reducing emissions domestically. However, as Katie mentioned as well, if the international offsets such as transfers of mitigation outcomes or credits are to be used to achieve their targets, additional information would be helpful in clarifying, for example, if there will be any limit in the usage of international offsets to meet their net zero target, the types of offsets being considered, and most importantly, if there will be measures to ensure there's no double counting of those emission reductions or removals. So this wraps up my presentation about where, when, and what has been communicated in the current net zero targets. It is really essential that the net zero targets are described clearly in terms of their greenhouse, sectoral coverage, time frame, use of international transfer, and limits of use of international transfers. All of the data points we're talking about can be found on our net zero tracker. It is currently a work in progress, and we will continue to keep our tracker updated with the latest information. And please stay tuned for new submissions and additional indicators. And with this, I will turn it to Reese.
Great, thank you so much, Mengpen, and to all of our speakers for I think was really rich presentation and a really tight 40 minutes. So hopefully you found that really, really helpful. It's been great to see so many questions already be submitted. If you have one, please go ahead and use that Q&A feature to post your own question or add another one if you'd like to. I do want to flag a couple of URLs here that are good references for you. The Net Zero Tracker on Climate Watch data.org definitely is a great resource. A lot of visuals we shared today are from that. And then there's also a long-term strategies explorer. There's also a NDC tracker, NDC explorer. So a lot of great resources there. And of course, Katie shared some research we've done on making sure that net zero targets are robust, as well as some great recent articles that we've published. So a lot of resources for you to dig into afterwards. That's your homework. But I want to now pivot to our question and answer portion of our event. Yeah, again, we got a lot of great ones. So I want to just jump right in, and speakers, we'll just do this as rapid fire as we can to make sure that we get through as many of these questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we'll give it a shot. And I will start with myself. A couple of questions. Two questions that came through was, will a recording of this webinar be available? And will you make this presentation available? The answer to both is yes. And they will be posted to the event page on wri.org. It might take a day or two before that recording gets up, but we'll get it up as soon as we can. We also will make the PowerPoint available for this specific webinar, because we did think that you guys would be excited to use some of these slides that we presented today. I now wanted to ask a few questions, and Johannes, I'll put this to you, and then if you want to defer it to Meng-Pin, feel free. But three quick questions. One is, how frequently is Climate Watch data updated? How do you handle uncertainty when it comes to the data sets? And then specifically, are bunker fuel emissions in the data set?
Yeah, happy to answer some of this question and see if Meng-Pin has anything to add. So this is the beauty around Climate Watch, because even though we will share the presentation in the video, if you wanted to have the latest information, it will always be on Climate Watch. Meng-Pin and her team are actually extremely fast in this, mostly in that usually within 24 hours that a new target is submitted, particularly around NDCs, which are coming in a lot right now. Within 24 hours, we're updating the basic information on Climate Watch. Often it's even faster. So if you are curious what's happening, Climate Watch is the best place to go. It might take us sometimes a little bit of time because it's hundreds of indicators to do the analysis that we do. So there might not always be the most granular data immediately available after new targets are submitted, but definitely go to climatewatchdata.org if you wanted to have the latest information. On bunker fuels, I supplied a quick information. We have bunker fuel information, which is international aviation and shipping. It is in line with the IPCC methodology, not included in country totals. But if you see the total emissions, the total global emissions, bunker fuels are included. And the methodologies are also fully transparent. So we want to be not only transparent and open with our data, but also with our methodology. So if you click on any of the data sets that you're interested in on this little I button on top, you'll actually get a summary of where we, sometimes it's us publishing the data, sometimes it's partners like LSE and other organizations that we partner with that publish the data, but you can always see where the data comes from, as well as the detailed methodology. You can tell me if you want to add anything. Great.
All right, great. And question for Meng-Pin, I think this actually was answered in your presentation. Maybe you can just clarify this. For countries that have set net zero pledges, do all of them cover all greenhouse gases, or do some only focus on CO2?
Yeah, I think Katie might have also typed the answer in the chat or to that question already, but almost all of them cover all greenhouse gas and sectors, which is good to see. But there are also quite some ambiguous languages that we try to interpret, or we interpret from, for example, long-term strategy documents of their coverage. But there are definitely ones that are not full sector and gas coverage.
Great, yeah, and then that's covered in that slide, so we can always, and that's actually available on the net zero tracker, so you can go look at those countries one by one if you'd like to. Katie, bunch of questions that I think you'll be best positioned for, so I want to get you in here as well. Great question that we often get, so it's good just to tackle it head on. The UN uses a higher percentage of global emissions when they're talking about the coverage of net zero targets and how many countries have net zero targets. Can you explain the difference between their figures and on our figures and percentages?
Thanks, Reese. This is indeed a question we get a lot. No count is wrong, but there are differences in the counts. WRI tends to take a much more conservative approach, looking at specific and accurate net zero target commitments. Our understanding of the UN number is that they're including commitments made under the 2019 Climate Ambition Alliance, where 120 countries and the EU also agreed to developing long-term net zero strategies. So our understanding is that they are including those countries in their count as well. Ours is a little bit smaller number.
Right. So that language towards, working towards a net zero target, and we
Exactly.
don't include those targets in our count.
Exactly.
Right. Another one, Bhutan. How did Bhutan already reach net zero? What's going on in Bhutan?
Well, according to the country, they say that their land sink is sequestering more emissions than they're currently emitting. So that's why they're saying they've achieved carbon neutrality already.
Great. It's a huge amount of forest in that country. What about the impact of reducing methane emissions? If we were able to cut those emissions very quickly, would that shift the required timeline for net zero CO2, for instance?
That's such a fantastic question. So methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It has tremendous warming impact because it lives in the atmosphere for a short amount of time. When you actually remove it from the atmosphere, you do get this immediate temperature benefit. So methane mitigation, along with the mitigation of other SLCPs, is really critical in the near term, particularly for preventing that critical overshoot of the temperature threshold. Methane is also a precursor to ground level ozone, which is a damaging air pollutant. So when you are reducing methane, you're also contributing to the air pollution challenge and helping to improve human health and food security as well, because some of these air pollutants are pretty damaging for crop yields.
Great. All right, I'm going to keep on going because we have so many questions. So we'll cover what we can here. Someone brought up how they were surprised by the concentration of 2050 as the kind of the year that so many countries are coalescing around, when countries have different capabilities and there's financial resources. Is there a right year for countries to be shooting for? Or what should they be thinking about?
Thanks, Reese. There's no perspective yet, a shared perspective on what a fair shared net zero target looks like, or what an equitable net zero target looks like. The literature does suggest you should be taking into factors such as historical emissions, current emissions, level of development, capacity to actually reduce these emissions, including finance. So these are all questions that are explored. I think it's quite interesting that a range of economies in different stages of development are setting net zero targets for 2050. So you have small island states such as Marshall Islands and Fiji committing to net zero by 2050. You have the US and Canada also committing to net zero by 2050. And these are not prescribed targets by anyone, but there is a kind of general movement toward this mid-century target setting, and I think largely informed by this scientific pathways that the IPCC have laid out.
Great. Another question we got was on offsets, and if there's recommendations or practices that countries should be following there. And you talked about how you should reduce emissions as much as you can, but is that down to 90%, 95%? At what point should you start to be thinking about offsets as being a reasonable and appropriate thing to pursue?
This is really going to depend on the national context and how much land is technically available to sequester carbon, and how much technologies are available. I think there are going to be some countries like Bhutan, for example, that have already become net negative. Another country like Singapore, for example, has really limited land resources, so is going to be highly constrained with reaching net zero on its own without the purchase of offsets. So those are just some of the dynamics that are going to be at play in the coming years. And I think I've done a little bit of a disservice. I think there have been a number of questions around ITMOs and the Paris Agreement and offsets. So perhaps I could just clear that up. I think offsets in Article 6, this is obviously a hot topic of discussion right now. It's going to be essential for mitigating emissions in the short term. I think the point that I just wanted to underscore is that if there are commitments across the board for reaching net zero emissions by mid-century, there are really going to be limits on how many additional credits and how many countries have net negative emissions that are going to have offsets that are allowed to be tradable. So I just wanted to clarify that. I hope that helps a bit. And obviously this is just my opinion as well. This is not set in stone either.
Great. Well, so one question we had here was, how can stakeholders track if countries are actually making progress towards achieving the net zero targets, not just setting their net zero targets? Yeah, anyone want to take that one?
I'll start with the easy answer is look at their historical greenhouse gas emission inventory. And I know there is a lag, but that's the most accurate way of seeing where their emissions are actually heading. I'll leave the hard part to Katie and Johannes.
Well, picking up on a point I said is there have got to be some very clear stepping stones and milestones toward achieving the net zero target that suggests that countries are on a pathway toward achieving those goals. And some countries even have shorter timeframes through carbon budgets where you have very clear wedges about how that abatement is going to be achieved.
Yeah. Maybe I'll throw in there, I think that we haven't talked a lot about NDCs in this context, but NDCs are obviously an interim target, right? And so if their countries are setting NDCs that can credibly be aligned, you know, in theory at least, with a net zero target, that's helpful, right? To see that there's a lot of seriousness behind it versus being, you know, potentially a target that they're saying they'll shoot for, but don't really have the pathways and policies to get on that trajectory. And we do try to kind of track the NDCs and how credible and ambitious they are to some extent on our tools as well. Another question we have here was how or do national net zero targets relate to net zero targets that businesses and cities are setting? What's that relationship, and is there concern about this issue of like double accounting, taking more credit for emission reductions and net zero than they actually are? Can you explain that, Katie?
Yeah, there's a lot of momentum around the subnational action as well. I mean, there's no formal architecture yet about how these different initiatives relate to each other. I mean, ideally, you have this nested structure where we're all trying to achieve the global goals of reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, where the net zero targets contribute to those. And then the underlying targets within countries that businesses and investors and regions are setting, ultimately feeding into the achievement of the national goal.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I know there's a lot of questions here, but I'll keep on going here. So low-income countries, you kind of mentioned how some countries have set net zero targets, even if they're small island states, don't have much in the way of financial resources. So how can those economies leapfrog to a net zero solution? And is climate finance critical for them to be able to achieve their targets, or could they actually achieve them on their own?
Well, one of the findings from the IEA report is that the role of international finance for developing countries is particularly crucial in this net zero transition. I mean, not only in terms of catalyzing public finance, but also the role of the private sector in financing some of these initiatives in developing countries, which they've been more reluctant to do in the past. So that is critical. The economics are making increasing sense, even in the developing world. You know, solar and wind are increasingly cost competitive. Solar is outpacing the cost of fossil fuels in most economies now, wind similarly. So there are a lot of benefits that come along with it. Again, to reference the IEA report again, there are also going to be jobs created associated with this transition. Where jobs are created and where jobs are lost is still problematic, but overall, this transition is expected to see an increase in growth in jobs. Great,
thanks. All right, so I have I'm not necessarily a tougher question, but certainly one of those big, lofty questions people ask themselves when they work on climate change. You know, despite the need, everyone's saying how we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, reach net zero emissions, you know, by around 2050, so at the global level. Global emissions, you know, if you take 2020 as the exception, have been rising still, right? So we're actually getting, in some ways, farther away from the stepping stones we need to get to a net zero future. And then also net zero, as you were saying, depends in part on carbon removal technologies that are still kind of getting off the ground. They're out there, but they're not really picked up at a commercial scale. So the big fundamental question is it still really possible to reach net zero emissions and keep global temperature rise under 1.5 to avoid catastrophic climate change? I'm sorry, Katie, but I'm going back to you.
Fine. I mean, those are great questions. You know, the research says that this transition is possible. And I mean, I know this is often cited, but if you have a look at the IEA projections for renewables and how they've changed over time and how reality has actually outpaced the cost of the transitions that were actually envisaged through the models, I think that tells a compelling story. And I think, you know, emphasizing these other development benefits that come along with climate action are really crucial for getting the job done. So bringing out these economic benefits, bringing out the job benefits, I mean, importantly, bringing out the health benefits. So when we are looking at these significant transitions envisioned in the energy sector, this is going to significantly impact people's lives. They'll have improved air quality. And this is particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable, which we need to look out for the most.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we have just a few minutes left here, but I want to make sure that we cover some more ground. I think, Mengpen, Johannes, maybe you've been skimming through other questions. Maybe I can just turn the floor over to you, Mengpen, first, if that's okay, about if there's anything you've seen or other points you wanted to stress that could be helpful for the group to hear.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions that I find interesting is around the lines of what are the best practices of what countries should be communicating in their net zero targets, what information should be provided. I guess I want to emphasize again back to the list that Katie showed of how to spot a robust net zero target. And another goal of what we're trying to do is to introduce more indicators as countries becoming more transparent about their net zero target or start to incorporate those targets into their formal documents, is to keep track of those descriptions. Would be in a very similar fashion that we would do for a regular greenhouse gas emission target included in countries, say NDCs, and to include those information to facilitate the transparency, clarity, understanding, both to the target and also on how those targets would be accounted. So the accounting methodology, the inclusion of international offsets, for example, the accounting of forests at that point.
Great, thanks. And Johannes, how about you?
Yeah, I'm trying to answer as many questions as I can. Thank you for overwhelming us with so much interest. I think there was several questions around also like uncertainty of the data and how comparable it is. And just a general answer that we know that like no data set is perfect, basically, and we just try to make sure that you understand like what the different pros and cons are. Like there's certain advantages of looking at certain data sets versus others. So if you are on the, for example, on the greenhouse gas emissions data set, there's a whole FAQ that explains if you're interested in comparable data versus very comprehensive data, or which one has the most accurate like total and so on, and what the uncertainties around sectors. We're trying to explain that quite a bit and make it as transparent as possible towards the greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, are very important regarding, as we said, tracking progress. Even though this is a very complex topic, because this is why if you look for that question, there isn't usually just one answer if a country is actually on track. What we really have to do, both with the NDCs as well as with the LTS, which you actually see in the greenhouse gas emission picture, is we really have to bend the curves down. Like countries have to peak currently. Some of the main concerns are actually just like making these commitments and then getting countries down. Some of these uncertainties that you have in certain sectors are definitely becoming a concern, and that you validate, for example, inventories independently are going to be becoming more and more important in the future. Currently, you still see that emissions are unfortunately still in many countries are going up, and I think bending them down is kind of like a really, really important role, where the short-term NDC targets and the longer-term net zero targets can really set short-term and long-term goals.
Great, thank you, Johannes. So we are at the hour, but I wanted to ask maybe one more question of you, Katie. So we had a lot of people join us today. I think we got up to over 550 or so people, which is fantastic. So it's great to see there's so much interest. And I'm sure it's a diversity of people in the audience. If we had, say, policymakers or people working with governments, and they are in governments that are considering setting net zero targets or looking for ways to further strengthen the net zero targets, what would you say to them as like a good next step, after they've concluded this webinar? What should they read next? What should they do next? How could WRI support them?
Thanks, Reese. I think I'd say two things here. I think the one is about communicating a very clear target, and this comes to some of the points that I was raising earlier. So be very clear in terms of what transitions you envision, what sectors you're covering, what gases you're covering, how much of the target you think you can meet through domestic reductions. And then, I mean, this is where the important comes. How are you actually going to go about achieving this target? And this is when generally need to do and undertake significant modeling exercises, develop pathways for achieving those goals, look at the real trade-offs, right? Because there will be significant trade-offs as we're looking ahead to these transitions. And I mean, bringing in the key stakeholders of your country is absolutely essential, because what the research shows is that every person and company and region has a part to play in this net zero transition. So involving them as much as possible, bringing out the benefits of this transition as much as possible, really having a frank discussion about the transitions, the difficult transitions, and the ways in which workers and their livelihoods will be impacted will also be essential. So these are just some of the starting points I think we'd recommend, and hopefully some of the resources we've been able to share today can be helpful on that journey.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I completely agree. I think it's great resources. I thought this was a really productive and information-packed sessions. Hopefully all of you will find that as well. And again, just to confirm for everyone, this webinar has been recorded. It will be on the event page at WRI.org in a day or two. So I think we'll conclude there. So first I just want to thank the audience for joining us on this important conversation. Please keep on doing whatever you can do to help deal with climate change and get us towards a net zero pathway. And I really want to especially thank our speakers for their time and dedication to this very productive and interesting webinar. So Katie, Mengpin, Johannes, thank you all very, very much. And also thank you to the organizers that are behind the scenes, but we know who you are. So really appreciate all of your support. All right, so I'll leave it there. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.